Hi, welcome to my final installment of the set of three lectures for David Schweickart chapters 3 and 4, or excerpts from David Schweickart chapters 3 and 4 in After Capitalism. In this lecture, I want to focus on Schweickart chapter 4. In chapter 4, Schweickart considers a number of perverse manifestations of the capitalist structure. Basically, the idea is that capitalism, given its very structure, it's going to lead to some persistent and recurring problems. And ultimately, these problems, I think, can be described as a kind of domination. So in chapters 4 and 5 of After Capitalism, Schweickart considers the problems that I have listed here in the right-hand column. Capitalism drives inequality, unemployment, overwork, poverty in the midst of plenty, economic instability, environmental degradation, and it makes a mockery of democracy. That's what Schweickart argues in chapters 4 and 5. I've only asked you to read chapter 4, and I haven't asked you to read the section in chapter 4 on inequality, though in this lecture I'm going to hit some high points of what Schweickart says there rather than asking you to read all that. And then I did ask you to read what he has to say about unemployment and overwork, and half of what he has to say about poverty. In chapter 5, he takes on economic instability, environmental degradation, and the mockery capitalism makes of democracy. I'm going to say a little bit about the mockery that capitalism makes of democracy. It'll be pretty clear once we cover, the basics of what's going on in chapter 4, though I won't go into all the detail from, this other chapter that I didn't ask you to read. But the idea is already implicit in the discussion in chapter 4, and I'll just bring that to the fore for you. Now, basically what he's doing in chapter 4 and chapter 5 is he's saying, look, here are all these problems that capitalism breeds, and we see them, I think, today in the world that we live in. Here in Canada, and certainly as we view what's going on in the United States these days, we can see it there as well. But we see this, throughout the capitalist world. And then he says, look, then he gives us reasons why he thinks that economic democracy is going to do a lot better with respect to these problems. And he doesn't use this term domination, or very rarely does he use that term. But what I want to do is pull what he's saying, closer to the course themes, and I think you can characterize just about everything on his list as manifestations of domination as we've been understanding it, where basically one set of actors is able to impose their interests on others at the expense of their interests in this system. Inequality, unemployment, overwork, poverty in the midst of plenty certainly fit into that category, as does the mockery capitalism makes of democracy. And the idea is that this capitalist structure, it puts us in these relations of domination where some folks' interests are being accorded greater weight than others given the way the whole system's set up and the way it's incentivized. Some folks have less say than others. I won't say so much about the social standing thing. It's sort of implicit here. But the idea is you get the kind of relations of domination that Anderson fears, that Rousseau fears in capitalism. Schweickart doesn't put things quite in that way, but he clearly, I think, would agree with that characterization. He belongs to this broad camp and approach to political philosophy and political economy. Okay, so let's just go through these one by one, where I'm going to say a bit about why Schweickart thinks capitalism leads to this ill that that's enumerated here that I'm going to discuss, and then why he thinks economic democracy will do better. But before embarking on this list, before embarking on the discussion of inequality, unemployment, overwork, poverty in the midst of plenty, and the mockery capitalism makes of democracy, I'm going to say a little bit about the behavioral consequences of the structural change in the economy that Schweickart is recommending. Schweickart has this idea that there's going to be a couple of key ways in which the system as a whole and key actors in the system will be incentivized to behave very differently under economic democracy than they do in capitalism. So here's the first major consideration. In economic democracy, labor is not a cost of production. So Schweickart says, since labor is not a cost of production in a democratic firm, such firms have no interest whatsoever in lowering labor costs, since those costs are precisely the income of the workers. Now let's just pause to think about this a little bit. So remember, in a capitalist firm, you have shareholders who buy stakes in the firm, or bondholders who loan to the firm. These shareholders are the ones that elect the board of directors, so they're kind of the engine of the decisions that are made by the firm. The board of directors then appoints a management, and this whole thing is structured to serve the interests of the shareholders. Now, what's the shareholders' main interest? Well, the shareholders' main interest is to get a profit from the production in the firm. I think that's why the whole thing's set up, right? It's set up, by that logic. And now the thing to keep in mind is when you have that structure where you have the capitalists wanting to get a profit from the firm, and the way they get a profit is that the laborers work, certain capital that's, owned by the firm to produce goods like toothbrushes or Chipotle burritos or, cars or whatever. When you have that kind of structure, labor is experienced, the wages of labor, anything that comes with the cost with labor, benefits or maybe even really nice surroundings in the workplace or what have you. All those things are experienced as a cost to the bottom line. Now, these capitalists, of course, it's not like they're bad people. It's just they're in a role where what they're interested in is maximizing their profit. They're not really thinking about they're not thinking of the labor or the wage of the laborers or the working conditions as a value. Rather, that thing is a cost. It goes against the thing that they're after in this relationship because they're after profit. So in a typical capitalist firm, labor is experienced as a cost, and capitalists are, what they want. The whole system is designed to try to lower things that it experiences as cost, to reduce things that it experiences as costs. By contrast, in a democratic firm, the workers own the organization, and they also drive the management decisions because the workers, elect and put into place and hold accountable, their managers. In this case, the whole system is designed in a way that the wages of the labor are not. The system doesn't see them as costs because the system is driven by the interests of the laborers, and of course the laborers do not see their wages or what they're paid as a cost. That's a fundamental difference in the logic of the firms in an economic democracy and the firms in a capitalist system. So given that big difference in the perspective, like the decision-making perspective, the thing that the system values, that has many important implications. One implication is that new technology might be introduced to increase productivity or job satisfaction in the democratic firms, but worker-run enterprises, unlike capitalist enterprises, don't have interest in introducing technology in order to de-skill their workers or maybe to replace their workers, because the workers are in there making the decisions, and they're not going to vote for things or vote for strategic moves that would de-skill them or that would result in lowering their wages or that result in their being laid off. So that's a big difference in sort of the decision-making perspective of the democratic firm and the capitalist firm. Also, democratic firms are rarely going to lay off workers, apart from cases where they just absolutely have to, a severe financial emergency like the Great Recession of 2008. They're just generally not going to do that because, of course, the democratic firms are ultimately accountable to the workers. Okay, So that's one big behavioral consequence of this change from a capitalist structure to this, political economy that is by and large populated by worker-owned firms. And the big punchline here is that labor is not experienced or viewed as a cost. The cost of labor is not viewed as a cost of production. It's one of the things that the whole system's after is remunerating and benefiting the people that work in it, because the people that work in it are the people that own and ultimately have a kind of accountability relationship with the decision makers. Okay, now here's another behavioral consequence, and this is also a big deal, and it takes just a little bit of time to explain. The big point is that democratic firms, worker-owned and managed firms, are much less likely to want to expand in their size than capitalist firms are. And that's because, and I'll say this and then I'll explain it, capitalist firms seek to maximize total profit, whereas democratic firms tend to maximize average profit per worker. This makes a big deal. So once again here, we have a fundamental difference in the perspective, the decision-making perspective of the firm. And let's see if I can explain to you why. And here I'm just going to use Schweikart's example. He says, look, imagine that there's a firm that has 10 workers, and each worker is paid $20,000. And we're going to imagine the same firm in a capitalist, if it's a capitalist firm, and the same firm as if it was a democratic firm, to see how it would reason differently, and why it would reason differently. Now, so you have this firm. It's made up of 10 workers. There's $20,000 a year salary that's going to each worker, and now there's an expansion opportunity. They could increase the size of the firm from 10 workers to 20 workers, still paying that $20,000 salary each. Now, let's just stipulate that when they kind of do the math, they're kind of thinking about, okay, should we do this or not? They're going to learn that, look, right now we get a total profit per year. We've been getting something like $100,000 a year. If we expand, the total profit of the firm is going to be $180,000 a year. Okay. Now, if you do the math, hopefully I haven't bumped up the math here. It turns out that in this case, before expanding, the average profit per worker is $10,000 per year, and after expanding, the average profit per worker is $9,000 per year. Okay, now a capitalist firm, it cares about its decision-making logic is going to be, looking at, okay, what's that total profit number? Because because the idea is, look, we can hold the number of shareholders steady, and this number of shareholders, you hold these folks steady, and what they care about is maximizing that total profit. Because then this number of shareholders, however it might be, that increases the profit per shareholder by increasing the total profit per firm. So long as you hold the number of shareholders steady, then you increase the average profit of the shareholders. And of course, the shareholders are going to want this expansion to happen in this case because they want their average profit to increase. And so there's going to be pressure in the system to make decisions that pursue these increases in total profit. But now contrast that with the system when the motivating logic is average profit per worker. Now remember, in a democratic firm, it's the workers that own the firm, and all the profit, it goes to them. But of course, they have to divide it amongst themselves. All the workers have to divide it amongst themselves. So in this case, if you increase the total profit from 100,000 to 180,000, but to do that, you have to increase the number of workers to 20, and let's just assume that all the workers are going to get paid the same here, we'll set that aside. But then it turns out that the average profit per worker is $9,000 per year per worker. Now, if you think about this, the decision-making structure of the democratic firm is going to be averse to making this expansionary move. It won't care that total profit will go from 100 to 180,000 because the thing that drives the democratic firm is what's going to happen to average profit per worker, because, as I said, the workers own the firm and they get all the profits. There is no shareholder class over here on the side. And so if expansion means increasing the number of employees, and then that comes at the cost of the average profit, then the democratic firm's just not going to go for it. Okay, so the idea is that there's a kind of this average profit per worker logic makes worker-owned firms less likely to want to expand their size and their output of production than capitalist firms, because capitalist firms are going to chase total profit, and that has a very different logic. It's a more expansionary logic. That's a big deal. It's a big difference between these two systems. And then there's yet another reason why democratic firms will tend to be less expansionary. It doesn't have as much to do with the amount of profit, but it has to do with the fact that of the amount of control that any particular member of the firm has. The idea is that most people will like it better to have a greater measure of control, fraction of control of their workplace rather than a lesser measure of control. So if you expand a workplace from 10 workers to 20 workers, that's going to come at a cost to all of the people in the workplace that were there when it was just 10 folks, because their vote in what happens will be diluted from having a 1 out of 10 say to having a 1 out of 20 say. And so the idea is that democratically managed firms are going to tend to be less expansionary than capitalist firms, because the workers who ultimately have the decision-making power here, they're going to be averse to having their control of the firm diluted in that way. So we've got two pretty powerful reasons that predict that worker-owned and managed firms will not be as expansionary. They'll be more content to kind of stay at whatever size they are. What will move them to grow is if by economies of scale they can somehow increase the average profit per worker. That's when they'll have reason to grow. Okay. So we've got these two reasons why democratic firms are less expansionary. I'm not going to say it again. I just said it. Don't want to repeat that, but you can look at the slide there to see that punch, see those two reasons. All right. Now there's some implications, and this isn't all the implications, but here are a couple of implications of the fact that democratic firms tend to be less expansionary than your typical capitalist firms that are owned by folks outside of the folks other than the workers in the corporation. One is that firms under economic democracy will tend to be smaller than comparable capitalist firms. Firms under economic democracy will be less intensely competitive. They don't. So one thing that drives competition in capitalist firms is each of the capitalist firm has a logic such that it wants to increase its total profit, and a way to do that is to either drive competitors out of business, and so they can take up their market share and then get increase their total profit, or to merge with those competitors. And so anyway, so there's this kind of competition that capitalist firms stoke because of the logic of going after total profit. But firms that are just interested in average profit per worker, they don't really care whether there's competitor firms. All they care about is whether they can maintain or perhaps increase their average profit per worker. And that just doesn't drive competition in the same way, or at least it doesn't drive this competition that seeks to drive others out of the market or merge with them in order to increase the total profit of the firm at the expense of the average profit per worker in the firm. This quickly connects to another feature of economic democracy, and this has to do with monopolistic tendencies. Now, just to be clear, what a monopoly is a situation where there's one or maybe a very small number of firms that have exclusive control over the market. Like they're the only, maybe you could have one airline, or maybe you just have Google, it's the only search engine. Monopoly is when there's only one provider of some good in a market. Monopolistic tendencies will be less pronounced under economic democracy because you don't have this competition to try to swallow up your competitors one way or another, or drive them out of the market in order to increase your total profit. It's much more likely that economic democracy firms will just be content to kind of stay where they are and exist with competitors so long as they can maintain their average profit per worker. Okay, so I've now enumerated some key differences in the logic of the democratic firm, and now I'm going to go on to a discussion of some problems that an economy that's by and large populated with capitalist firms, with this shareholder structure. I'm going to go on to enumerate a number of problems that Schweickart relates to that Schweickart argues will be mitigated or ameliorated in an economy populated largely by the democratic firms that are the mainstays of economic democracy. So first, let me talk about inequality. Now, I didn't ask you to read this section on inequality. In lieu of that, I'm just going to explain this slide to you, which is sort of encapsulates this extensive discussion that Schweickart has on inequality. Feel free to read and confirm that my numbers are right here, and grab whatever other nuggets you might want to find with Schweickart. But I think basically what you need to know from that section, you can see here very quickly with this chart, which I'll explain to you. So one of the key problems of capitalism, argues Schweickart, is inequality. One thing to note is that inequality in the world within countries is higher than it's been since the Gilded Age, right before. And in fact, I think these levels of inequality are as high, if not even more pronounced, than they were in the Gilded Age, which is sort of the Great Gatsby era, right before the Great Depression, way back in the early 20th century. And Schweickart, has an extended analogy to a parade of dwarfs to giants, where he tries to help us really see how stark these inequalities are. I'm just going to give you the numbers, and I'm certainly not going to enumerate every single line on this list, but I want to put it before you and point out some high points. So, how can we think about inequality? Well, here, Schweikart's frame of reference is the United States, and the year he's thinking about is 2009, which is a year after the Great Recession. And one thing I should say, even though this is focused on the United States, the United States is probably the worst in the world when it comes to this. The rest of the world is not too far off from this. I sent a thing on Avenue to Learn. There's a little chart there about inequalities, and you can kind of see how the United States, though its inequalities are more pronounced than most of the rest of the world. It's not, the differences aren't that great. You can kind of compare what Canada looks like with the chart that I posted to Avenue to Learn to what the U.S. looks like. Canada's better off on these measures, but not that much better off. So how do we think about how can we think about and conceptualize inequality? And here we're thinking about income inequality in the United States. How much money you're bringing in every year, be it by way of wages or by way of passive returns to income, like capitalists make. So here we're thinking about 120 million households. So this is an interesting thing about economic measures. A lot of these things, they actually look, measures of inequality, what they're looking at is differences between household incomes. And households are kind of these messy things. Like we could say that in the United States, the average household has somewhere between 3 and 4 people, probably like 3.2 people or 3.3 people or something like that. In Canada, the number would be roughly the same. But that doesn't mean that every household, of course, they don't have 3.2 people. Some households will have 3, some households will have 1, some households will have 5. It's just going to vary. But the unit is the household. And so you can just imagine, so the idea is now to try to get a handle on differences in incomes across households, where the average is going to be something like 3.2 people. Now, right away, we should distinguish two numbers, and I've run this by you before, I think in a couple lectures back. We can talk about the average household income in an economy, and we can talk about the median household income. And to get a handle on income inequality, it's really the median and numbers that are in that same category as the median that we want to look at. So you might have an economy like the United States where the average income is $68,000 per year, the average household income. And so that'll be, the average household income will be, 3 to 4 people, or, it could be 1 person, it could be 5 people, what have you. But the average household unit is going to have $68,000. But that's different from the median unit. The median unit is what you get if you line all 120 million households in the United States up in one big long line or one big parade. And it'd be the person in the middle of the parade if everyone's lined up from the lowest income earners to the very highest income earners. The median income will be the people in the very middle of the parade, and in the very middle of the American household income parade, that household is going to make $50,000 per year. And that household, and like I said, that household could be composed of probably somewhere between 3 and 4 people. It's going to be composed of 3 or 4 people. Probably, that's the most likely combination there. Okay, now the number we want, what we're looking at here, I have a little chart here. The median's like right in the middle of this chart. Like you line up all 120 million people. We have the median right here in the middle at the 60 to the 96th million person, where that 96th million person is richer than the 60 million person. At the median, you start at 50,000 and you go up to 100,000. Now at the very bottom, the first 10 million people, those households will make $11,300 a year and less. Then the next, from 10 to 25 million, those folks in that range make between $11,300 to $22,600 a year. Between 25 and 40 million, $22,600 to $34,000 a year. I don't know about you folks, but I find it really hard to imagine what it's like to be a household of 3 or more people making incomes like that. That doesn't. I just don't know how those folks make ends meet. But anyway, this is a snapshot of the way things were in 2009 in the United States. Now we go on, and I don't want to say what happens at each level, but what I want to point out is what happens at the very end. We've seen, kind of here in the middle, from kind of the 50% mark to about the 80th percent mark, you've got 50,000 to 100,000. After the 80th percent, you start to climb pretty quickly in what the income levels are. If you come all the way down to the 108 to 114 million level, that's our top 10%. It's going to be folks, bottoming out at the let's see, where is that? 108. That is the top 10% to about the 95th percent of the income distribution. Then here from 114 million, that's like the 95th percent, to the top 1% of the income distribution. And then, look, you go to the top 1% and you start getting, within the top 1%, things start to they really start to take off. So if you're in the top 1%, you're going to be making, if you're at the bottom of the top 1%, you're going to be making about $400,000 a year. If you go from the bottom of the top 1% to the bottom of the 0.1%, you're going to be making at the bottom of the 0.1%, you're going to be making $1.6 million per year. From the bottom of the 0.1% to the bottom of the 0.01%, you're going to be making between $1.6 million to $9 million a year. We've got about we've got about 12,000. We've got about 120,000 households making about that amount. About 108,000 households are making that amount in the U.S. right as of 2009. Then at the very tippy top, you'll have the highest paid CEO in 2009. He brought in $100 million a year. His household probably brought in roughly the same. Any billionaire, if you have $1 billion of wealth in the bank, so a billionaire is someone who has $1 billion of wealth, $1 billion of shares, basically, capital that they can get passive incomes on. If you're a billionaire and you invest it moderately, wisely, and get a modest 6% return on that thing, you're going to be making $60 million a year. So imagine a billionaire like Bezos, who's worth about $148 billion. He's going to be making $60 million times $148 dollars every year. Then if you look at the top 25 hedge fund managers in the world, they're making $1 billion a year on average, and then the very richest hedge fund manager is making $4 billion a year. Okay, so you can see there's this incredible inequality skew in the American economy. Canada's better on this measure than the United States, but it's not that much better. Schweikart's big point is that capitalism tends to come with these kinds of inequality skews. We've gone through a period, we sort of saw this with the Blythe lecture, we had this Gilded Age period with dramatic and stark inequalities. There was World War II and the Great Depression, and then we had 1945 to 1980, we had a kind of compression in these things, but from 1980 till now, these things have really taken back off again, and now we're back to these income levels, these inequality levels. Schweikart's argument is that it's capitalism that's driving this. And he just gives us a little bit of evidence for why he thinks that economic democracy is not going to lead to this. And really, I find one thing that I think is worth pointing out from this section on inequality. Remember last time we discussed Mondragon, this worker cooperative, this complex of worker cooperatives in the Basque region of Spain that employs something like 85,000 workers. It allows a 4.5 to 1 differential in incomes between anyone working in the firm. So the topmost level manager, the CEO of like the biggest part of Mondragon, can only make 4.5 times as much as the least well-paid person in the firm. That's dramatically different in large capitalist firms, where that ratio tends to be is typically more like 400 to 1 today. That's a big deal. That's a big difference. And Schweickart wants to say, look, you just scale up the logic of Mondragon, and if all firms are organized in this cooperative way, that can't help but dramatically curve this inequality skew that you see in capitalist systems. It won't create perfect equality, and I don't think Schweickart thinks that's necessarily even desirable, but it will certainly dramatically, significantly, cataclysmically compress the current inequality skew. Going from 400 to 1 differential to 4.5 differential is orders of magnitude in difference. If you think inequality of income is a problem, this argues Schweickart, economic democracy argues Schweickart, there's good evidence why it would be a solution. Okay, now let me move on to a second ill of capitalism that Schweickart describes, unemployment. And here I did ask you to read about this, and I'm going to point out some high points of what Schweickart says about unemployment. And I think something that's really important to get from Schweikart's discussion is this idea of the fundamental contradiction underlying the capitalist economies of any sort. And we've already hinted at this contradiction, but Schweickart brings this out to the fore. And it's a big part of, from this perspective, it's a big part of what's problematic with capitalism. In capitalist systems, wages are both a cost of production and an essential source of effective demand. And this is really important. And I'm going to pause to try to, make sure that as many of you folks out there as possible can kind of get the importance of this. So as we saw, in any firm, wages is, that's what you pay the workers. In a capitalist firm, those wages are experienced as a hit to the bottom line of profit. If you pay the workers more, then the shareholders are going to get less profit from their investment in the firm. The shareholders drive the decision making, so the decision making is oriented in a way to where it sees the cost of labor, the wages, as a cost. It sees it as something to be reduced. And you want to get as efficient as possible because you want to maximize that return to the shareholder. You want as little of the profit as possible to be, eaten into by the cost of labor. You want to make wages as low as possible, wages as low as you possibly can, while still getting decent employees. Okay, so wages are experienced as a cost. There's going to be this general pressure, this downward pressure on wages because the decision-making apparatus of capitalist firms sees wages as a cost, something that we want to make as low as possible, as low as we can get away with. But here's the problem. All these firms in the capitalist economy, they're producing stuff to sell to the public. And most of the public in a capitalist economy is a wage laborer. And so wages are a source of effective demand. So the thing that keeps the capitalist economy going, that the thing that makes it possible for firms to make any money, is that there are people out there who have money to buy the goods that the firms are producing. So look at this contradiction in the system. The short-term decision-making time horizons of capitalist managers leads them, over and over as individual decision makers in particular firms to say, hey, we're going to do whatever we can to reduce our costs of labor. We're going to, put downward pressure on wages as far as we can do so that we can, maximize the bottom line profit for the shareholder. So every individual firm is going to do that, and it's in their rational interests given what they're trying to do. They're trying to make decisions that are in the immediate interests of their shareholders, the shareholders' bottom line. But look what happens when all the firms do this. When all the firms do this throughout the economy, that suppresses wages throughout the economy. And by suppressing wages throughout the economy, you're going to suppress demand. And so now what you're going to get is a situation where there's going to be less demand. You're going to have a demand-deficient economy because there aren't people with enough money to buy this stuff that all these firms could produce. And that's going to be a drag on economic growth and economic productivity. It's going to suppress the expansionary dynamic of the economy as a whole. And as a result of that, what you're going to get is, a whole bunch of things. But one of the things that you're going to get is you're going to get higher levels of unemployment that you might have had otherwise. Because, of course, if there aren't people out there in the economy with sufficient money to buy products that firms would sell, then firms aren't going to engage in these new economic activities that would require them to hire more people. Rather, they're going to just sit back because there's no one to sell their goods to. So there's a kind of circular or a vicious circle, a vicious cycle of suppression of the economy, suppression of the wages, and suppression of economic growth and productivity growth in an economy like this. Capitalism, because of its underlying contradiction, generates this kind of depressed, this general depression in the economy in general, where there's not enough demand out there to buy all the stuff that the capitalist economy could potentially produce, but it won't produce it because the wages are too low across the economy, and so the public doesn't have money to buy the stuff. Okay, so Schweickart's point here is that given the short-term decision-making individual horizons, decision-making horizons of the managers of capitalist firms, in the aggregate, they're going to act in ways that creates higher levels of unemployment than we might otherwise see. Capitalism, this fundamental contradiction of capitalism, is going to continually drive unemployment and make it basically impossible to get full employment in the economy, namely employment of everyone who, if they worked, would contribute to the growth of the economy. So for Schweickart argues that unemployment is baked into the cake of capitalist employment, of the capitalist economy, because of this fundamental contradiction in the capitalist economy. He also points to another reason why you find unemployment in capitalist economies. And here he's a little hazy, he doesn't connect all the dots, but I think we can say enough to see how this might be. Certainly, it would be worth our while. We can't do it in this course. It would be worth anyone's while to kind of think through how this actually happens, how this gets put into place, how it is the policies get made that follow this logic of a capitalist economy, how it is that this logic gets implemented and embodied in the system. But here's the general idea. A healthy capitalism requires unemployment, says Schweickart. It is because what a healthy capitalism needs is a reserve army of the unemployed that serves to discipline the workforce. If unemployment is too low, workers get uppity and make wage demands that either cut into profits to the degree that future investment is jeopardized or are passed on to consumers, generating inflationary instability, like we saw with Blythe, right, in the Great Compression period. So the idea is, look, in general, capitalist decision makers are happy with high levels of unemployment because if there's full employment, that's going to create a situation where the bargaining power of labor gets too strong, and that's going to eat into their profit. And so the idea is that capitalists, whenever they can, they're going to be supportive of decisions that certainly don't allow for full employment in the economy, and that ensure that you have this, this is a Marxian phrase, this reserve army of the unemployed. And what that does is it disciplines the workforce. It keeps them from bargaining too powerfully for an increased bite or share of the profit pie. All right. Now, economic democracy, by contrast, argues Schweickart, is not going to lead to unemployment in the same way. First, but it's complicated. Argues Schweickart. The first thing he points out is that democratic firms are loath to hire and to fire workers. We've seen that in the discussion today. So a democratic firm, it's very there are a lot of pressures against firing workers within a democratic firm because, of course, the workers are the ones who are ultimately driving the decision-making structure. Ultimately, the workers are the persons to whom the managers are accountable to the workers, and the workers can create a system where it's not so easy, and the system as a whole, this decision-making structure is not inclined. It's not ready. It won't readily fire workers. Won't readily let them go. But at the same time, as we've seen, democratic firms don't tend to hire workers because they're not really that big into expanding, because all they care about is maximizing average profit per worker, and this, that decision-making perspective is worried about diluting the say of any particular worker in the existing firms. So Schweickart notes that, well, at that bit of the logic of the economic democracy suggests that unemployment might be a problem. It could be a problem because democratic firms they're not on their own, given their basic structure, their incentive structure. They're not going to be, out there recruiting workers all the time. They're going to be kind of happy with the size that they are. For that reason, in this complete package of economic democracy that Schweickart describes, he introduces a couple of things that are supposed to remedy this, to ensure that you get more workers hired in the system, that ensure that you get something that's closer to full employment. First, the community banks, remember the community banks in this system that are these governments, this federation of government-funded banks charged with making capital decisions. Part of what their mandate will be is to invest in ways that will stoke employment. So, part of their job description will be to find entrepreneurial opportunities, to make it a tick in their favor if there are opportunities that will employ more people as opposed to lead to less employment. So that's one way he thinks we could design economic democracy to push towards something more like full employment. And then another way, and this is a biggie, is the addition of a policy that introduces this requirement that the government act as an employer of last resort. So anyone who can't find a job in one of these firms can go work for the government, a kind of permanent working WPA, where that was an agency in the New Deal, where there's all kinds of, maybe it'll be infrastructure projects, or maybe AmeriCorps, where you're out there helping different parts of the population, or maybe like a Canada Corps, just this reserve of folks that are of jobs for folks that can't find a job in any of these workers' cooperatives, of things that need to be done, projects that the state wants to do in service of public good. Maybe building infrastructure, servicing different parts of the community in ways that are underserviced. It's not clear what all would go under there. The idea is that the government could do this kind of thing. Now, so Schweickhart's idea is that in order to get full employment in economic democracy, you have to add these two tweaks at least to make sure that everyone who can contribute to the economic pie will contribute to productive activity in the economy as a whole. Now, Schweickart asks, right now in the capitalist system, it's initiatives like these are, they would be dead on arrival. The political system wouldn't have much stomach for this. In the United States or in Canada, it's hard to see how any of the parties in power right now would say, "Oh yeah, let's do this. Let's put a full-blown government as employer of last resort with good jobs for folks who need them, a constant source of good jobs for folks who need them." It's hard to see how the government today would do anything like this. In the United States, you had something that sort of got like that, but that required, the emergencies of the Great Depression and World War II to put something in place like that. In Canada, the United States, any contemporary democracy, capitalist economy, it's hard to see how this sort of thing is actually going to get through the political system. Same thing with the community banks. That's kind of a big thing for the state to be doing, to be making these decisions with an eye toward stoking employment. That's something that, there's a reason why we don't have something like that in contemporary capitalist economies. And so the question is, why would things be any different in economic democracy? Well, Schweickart says, look, we already know why things will be different. In this lecture, I've already enumerated the main reasons. And here I'm going to just summarize what, or I'm just going to rehearse what Schweickart has to say. The punchline is that he thinks that capitalism and economic democracy are going to have very different political pressures. They're going to have very different political currents that point in very different directions because of the difference of the imperatives, the logic, the nature of the logic that drives the firms and the two different kinds of economies. So under capitalism, so let's start with capitalism. In capitalism, here's what Schweickart has to say. The threat of job loss remains the basic disciplinary mechanism of the system. Under capitalism, workers do not see their own interests as being in fundamental alignment with the interests of their enterprises because objectively they aren't. A capitalist enterprise is structured to serve the interests of the owners, not the workers. Lowering skill requirements, reducing wages, intensifying the pace of work. None of these familiar capitalist strategies benefits the workforce. So worker allegiance to company interests is not sufficient to maintain work discipline, to keep people coming to the job and doing what they're told. Fear of unemployment is essential. So here we're getting back to what we said a bit. A really important part of a capitalist society is that there is a reserve of unemployed, because unemployment has to be a real prospect. You can't have a full employment economy because otherwise people are going to, it's going to be difficult for capitalists to hold people to these various things that improve the profit bottom line for the shareholders. It's going to be hard to hold employees to these policies that improve the bottom line of the shareholders at the expense of these various interests of the workers. And interests that are relating to their wages, the pace of work, and the kind of work they do, and so on. Okay, so the idea is that for the capitalist system, it's really important that unemployment remain a viable, a disciplining prospect for any worker who might not want to go along with and work under conditions of the sort that serve the bottom line of the shareholders. Okay, so now one of the ideas then is, if you have a lot of folks in this capitalist system who have a lot of money, who have an interest in maintaining policies that preserve a threshold level of unemployment, then given the amount of money they have, the power they have with that money, they're going to be able to exert influence on the political system, to the decision-making process in the political system, the larger political system, to make sure that policies aren't in place that allow for full employment. Rather, they're going to push for policies that keep a reserve army of unemployed in the population. That's Mark Blythe's story about the difference between the thing that drove the move from the Great Compression to the neoliberal era. There's just going to be this fundamental tendency in capitalism. Capitalists have the power because they have all the money. They have so much money. We saw the income inequality skew. By virtue of that, they're going to have a lot of power to put pressure on the political system. And that power is going to create these currents of political pressure that support unemployment in the system and that go against some key interests of workers. Okay, now, what do the fundamental political pressures look like in economic democracy? In economic democracy, Schweickart argues, and here I'm quoting from Schweickart, unemployment is not required to maintain work discipline. The fundamental incentive is positive. You work hard because your income and that of your fellow workers is tied directly to your company's profits. And remember, in a worker-owned company, those profits go into your pocket, not some absentee shareholder's pocket. So you work hard because your income and that of your fellow workers is tied directly to your company's profits. You also know that incompetent or irresponsible behavior on your part affects the well-being of your coworkers and will not be suffered by them lightly. The large crude stick, fear of unemployment, that's what you have in the capitalist system, is replaced by the carrot of profit sharing and the more subtle stick of social disapproval. So the idea is that at a large level, at the big picture level, there's no part of the population, there's no powerful part of the public that wants to push for high levels of unemployment or a threshold level of unemployment. That doesn't serve anybody. And so Schweikart's big idea, back to this question, Schweikart's idea is that once you get economic democracy going, the political pressures are not going to push against putting community banks into place that have a mandate of stoking employment. They're not going to push against a policy that introduced government as employer's last resort. No one's going to have an interest that opposes those, and there's going to be a lot of folks who have interests in the existence of policies like this. This will help a lot of folks, and there's no capitalist class whose interests would be undercut by initiatives like this. So his idea is that in an economic democracy, that's a field that is much more ripe. It's much more fertile for the introduction of employment promoting policies to supplement, the basic structural changes that the worker-managed firms introduce into the system as a whole. Okay, now. So let me now talk about one of these ills of capitalism that Schweickart discusses in his chapter 5. I haven't asked you to read this bit, but you can get the general idea from what we've discussed already. And here, this is me. This is not Schweickart, but this is me summarizing some of the ways in which capitalism is going to make a mockery of democracy and egalitarian value. So the big picture is that a capitalist structure, an economy that has the capitalist firm with a rentier class, getting profits, getting income by virtue of the fact that they just have ownership in the firm and not by virtue of what they're doing on a day-to-day basis to add to the value of the productive activity. A political economy that's structured like that has this capitalist class of absentee rentiers or deriving these passive incomes. You have a class like that, you're going to have a class that is generally oriented against interests of the mass majority of the population's interests. Because remember, the vast majority of the population is not part of this capitalist class. The vast majority of the population is working for a living at some firm or the other. The salary, employment stability, and security, quality of working conditions, and ability of employees to have a say, those are all at odds with the capitalist owner's interests. Because all of those things, in one way or the other, threaten the bottom line, the total profit that the shareholders are after. Now, to be clear, this is not to say that shareholders are bad guys. Shareholders are behaving in a way that makes sense given the political and economic structure in which they're embedded. They occupy this role of capitalists. Of course, it's in their interest to maximize their bottom line. But it just so happens when you structure the economy in this way, that interest goes directly against the interest of the laboring class, whose interest the capitalist class basically sees as a cost, as something that is pitted against their interests. And of course, the capitalist class, because of things like that inequality skew in terms of money, is much more powerful than the laboring class. And also, they're much more. It's a smaller group, and it's going to be easier for them to, with their ability to influence, it's going to be easier for them to act in a more concerted fashion. So the idea is that what the capitalist structure does is it breeds this powerful class whose interests are pitted against the interests of most everyone else in the society. And of course, given that incentive and their greater power, they're going to convert their economic power into political power. They're going to use that economic power to influence the political process in ways that serve their interests, but as we've now seen, serving those interests goes directly against the interests of most of the population. The big punchline for Schweickart is that economic democracy removes this fundamental tension between the interests of the capitalist class and the interests of the workers. Economic democracy removes this fundamental tension, and hence its political system is less likely to be opposed to policies such as the government as employer of last resort and community bank funding of ideas that stoke employment. The key idea here is the capitalist system is structured in a way that is going to create this capitalist class that has disproportionate power, highly disproportionate power to influence the political process, and its interests are directly at odds with the interests of the vast bulk of folks in the population at large. And so a capitalist system, it has these pressures that are going to tend to the subversion of democracy, because you're going to have this powerful sliver of the population that's going to want to move the system as a whole in ways that serve its interests, irrespective of the say and the interests of the vast majority of the population. The idea then is that the way the capitalist system is structured, the ownership structure of the firms and the means of production it's just going to abidingly undermine democracy, because once again, just to say it one more time, it's going to create this set of folks whose interests are at odds with everyone else, because many of the interests of everyone else go against the bottom line of the capitalist class. The interest of everyone else in terms of wages, working conditions, public goods, all of those things are experienced as at odds with the profit bottom line of the capitalists, these passive, absentee, rentier income earners. Those folks have both the power, they have interests that are at odds with everyone else, and they have the power to exert their will in accordance with their interests. That's just going to subvert democracy. All right, apologies for that. I sort of went in circles, said the same thing over and over again, but this is a key point. Hopefully this will have helped kind of bring to the fore this idea. And then this connects to the larger course themes. Schweickart, I think what we can see, if insofar as capitalism tends to subvert democracy, what it does is it leads us to a situation in which there's one class that is both empowered and incentivized to impose its interests on everyone else in the society, the vast majority of the society, and that's basically satisfying the definition of a domination relationship that we've been talking about. It creates a society, it creates a system of policies that systematically give greater weight to the interests of the people in the capitalist class, and it also creates a society in which serving the interests of the capitalist class necessarily comes at the expense of a big chunk of the society. The argument here is that capitalism tends to lead us to this domination equilibrium. And the hope is that economic democracy, by just removing that capitalist class and making all workers the owners of their place of work, that you're going to remove this fundamental tension between worker and owner. The workers, by collapsing the worker and owner role, you remove this fundamental tension between interests of different parts of the political economy. And that removes the incentive and the ability for one subset of the economy to dominate another subset. Okay, now there's two more ills of capitalism that Schweickart, that I've asked you to read about, that Schweickart discusses in chapter 4. One is overwork, like the overwork of the laborers. And here you can, I'm not going to say much at all because now you can see the story. Capitalism doesn't really care about this. The workers' overwork is not directly experienced as a disvalue by the decision makers and the absentee capitalists. Look, the whole system under capitalism is the decision-making system in the workplace is designed to do things that increase the profit of the absentee shareholders. The overwork of the employees is not going to register as a cost. It just depends upon what, or at least not immediately, not in itself. But by contrast, in economic democracy, the drivers of the decision-making, the workers, do experience their own overwork as a cost. Just immediately as a cost. To work too much is a cost, and hence that's going to be weighed in the decision-making system as a disvalue, something to be avoided unless there's really good reason not to. And so the argument here is that Schweickart documents a bit that capitalism has, certainly in the United States, but in other countries as well, has seen an increase in working hours and all these kinds of things for workers. His argument is that economic democracy, because it aligns the interests of the workers and the decision makers in the firm, it's going to tend to remove the pressures that lead to firms asking too much of their workers, asking them to work too much. And then here we get I think you can see the story on poverty as well, just very quickly. It follows very quickly from what we've said before. Poverty is being in a condition where you just don't have enough money to meet your basic needs. Where things like food scarcity is an issue for you, or food deprivation might even be an issue for you. Food, housing, just the basics to get by. A technical definition of poverty is going to say someone's impoverished when those things are not being met. Those basic needs are not being met. You don't have enough money to make those basic needs met. You don't have enough income to meet those basic needs. The Schweikart's point is going to be that, look, poverty is largely driven by the fact that not everyone who wants a job can get a job. Not everyone who wants a job can get a decent paying job. And that phenomenon, says Schweickart, is something that of course you're going to see in capitalism, because capitalism needs to suppress wages and capitalism needs to maintain this reserve army of unemployed. And of course, it's that mostly the impoverished folks are going to be people that are in that reserve army of the unemployed. By contrast, in economic democracy, there's not a systemic imperative for disciplinary levels of unemployment. So the idea is that because unemployment won't be as big of a problem in economic democracy, there's reason to think that poverty won't be either. Okay, that concludes my discussion of Schweickart. Let me wrap it up with just some big picture points, just some things that I want you to carry away. I'm not going to discuss these at length again. I'm just going to mention them. These were discussed in the lecture. I would encourage you to just make sure that at some point you have a handle on each of these bullet points. First, one big picture point: labor is not a cost for worker-managed firms, whereas it is for a capitalist firm. So there is a disalignment of interests between the people who make decisions in capitalist firms and the people that work in them that you don't see. Those interests are actually aligned within the worker-managed firms. So that's big deal number one, big picture point number one. Big picture point number two: worker-managed firms seek to maximize average profit per worker rather than total profit. That really affects the way that firms will behave in an economic democracy versus a capitalist democracy. A capitalist economy. Third, the contradiction of capitalism. This is a big point. You don't necessarily, of course, you don't necessarily have to agree with this claim, but you certainly should understand it so that you can assess it. The claim is, and this is a claim that you find in this kind of egalitarian, from this egalitarian perspective, folks like Schweickart and Anderson would all agree with something like this. Capitalist firms generally seek to reduce labor costs, and this suppresses systemic demand. So this is the point that capitalist firms, they make decisions in the individual interests of the firms and the shareholders of that particular firms that in the aggregate actually are against the interests of everybody, because those decisions are driven to suppress labor costs, which means firing people or paying them less. And what that's going to do is it's going to put less money out there in the economy amongst potential consumers, and that's going to suppress systemic demand. And it's actually going to create a kind of vicious circle if we aren't careful, because if systemic demand gets pushed down, then that's going to put even more pressure on companies to cut costs and in order to maintain profits, and we're just going to have this kind of spiral. The idea is that in an economy populated by democratic firms, you wouldn't have this basic contradiction of capitalism, because there wouldn't be this, the decision makers in particular firms really don't have incentives to pay their laborers less, because they're not trying to save a cut of the profits for shareholders whose bottom line they're trying to protect. Rather, all the profits get redistributed. All the profits are for the laborers in a democratic firm. So you don't have this the same kind of tension. You don't have the same imperative to decrease how much the laborers are getting paid for the work, and then that's going to allow for more demand in the economy as large, because the laborers are going to, they're going to have these profits, but then go spend on goods and then there'll be this potential demand in the economy that yet other firms can respond to, innovate for and try to meet. Final point, and this is a big one, and this has to do with the themes of the course. A capitalist system creates a capital class who has the wherewithal and the incentive to dominate the working class. The capitalist system creates a class of folks whose interests are fundamentally out of alignment with all the workers in the system. That's the key problem of capitalism. It creates this class who has interests and who has the power to suppress the interests of others. They have the interest to suppress the others because their interests are in immediate conflict with the interests of the others. And ultimately, it's just a variation on this idea that the capitalist bottom line is negatively affected by the pay or the benefits received by people employed in capitalist firms. That feature of the capitalist relationship bakes a kind of domination relationship in the cake. It creates a class that both wants to and can systematically suppress the interests of most everyone else in the society in service of their own interests. That is the big punchline. And then for Schweickart, an economic democracy, by removing this passive income earning class that's outside of the everyday productive activity of any firm, by removing that capitalist class, by creating an economy that doesn't rely on a capitalist class, it removes this conflict of interest. It removes the potential dominators from the system. There's no one in the system that occupies a role that's going to lead them and enable them to dominate. It's not like the people who are the dominators, they get removed. It's rather the role. They can no longer step into that role that turns the people into dominators. That's the big punchline. That's the big reason Schweickart thinks we've got to move from a capitalist class, from a capitalist system to something like economic democracy, because otherwise we're not going to get away from a world of macro scale domination relationships. Okay, that's all I've got for Schweickart. I very much look forward to talking to you folks next time.